The city glowed under a veil of drizzle, neon signs flickering in puddles that stretched along the sidewalks. The rhythmic patter of rain against the glass was the only sound filling Jonathan Carter's office. He sat in his high-backed leather chair, a file open before him, its contents splayed like an accusation. Customer satisfaction ratings were slipping, employee morale was at an all-time low, and online reviews painted a picture he barely recognized: unfriendly service, inconsistencies in food quality, an experience that lacked warmth. He ran a hand through his neatly trimmed hair, exhaling slowly. How had he let things get this bad? For years, Carter's Grill had been his pride. It had started as a single restaurant, a humble, welcoming place where families gathered, where food wasn't just about nourishment, but about connection. Then came the expansion. New locations, investors, board meetings. Somewhere along the way, the personal touch had faded, buried beneath efficiency reports and quarterly earnings. That was why he was here now. Not as CEO Jonathan Carter, but as a nameless customer walking through the rain, the brim of his baseball cap pulled low. The disguise was simple: worn jeans, a faded hoodie, and sneakers that had seen better days. No one would look twice at him. Just another guy grabbing a late-night meal. That was exactly what he needed. A restaurant in decline. The moment he stepped inside the restaurant, a wave of familiarity washed over him. The warm scent of sizzling burgers and golden fries hung in the air, mingling with the sharper tang of cleaning chemicals. The overhead lights buzzed softly, casting a yellowish hue over the handful of customers scattered across the booths. But something was off. The menu board flickered at one corner. The laminated paper menus stacked near the register looked greasy to the touch, and the employees behind the counter wore the kind of exhaustion that couldn't be masked by a forced smile. This wasn't how it used to be. Jonathan slid into line, his hands stuffed in his pockets. A teenage cashier stood at the register, shifting from foot to foot as she tapped on the screen. Her uniform was slightly oversized, her name tag tilted. Emily. She barely made eye contact with the customer in front of her, her voice flat as she read back the order. Behind her, a cook worked the grill, his movements practiced but sluggish. There was no energy, no enthusiasm, just the slow grind of a job that had become a chore. Jonathan's stomach tightened. The boys behind him. A voice behind him cut through his thoughts. "Do you think we have enough?" Jonathan didn't turn immediately, but his ears sharpened at the hesitant whisper. The speaker was young, probably 10 or 11. A second voice, steadier but just as unsure, responded. "We can split a meal. Mom said we shouldn't spend too much." Slowly, Jonathan glanced over his shoulder. Two boys stood just behind him. The older one, maybe 12, had a protective stance, a hand tucked into his younger brother's shoulder. Their clothes were clean but faded, their sneakers scuffed. The younger boy clutched a few crumpled bills in his small fist, staring at the menu board with a mix of longing and calculation. Jonathan turned his gaze forward again, something tightening in his chest. He had built this restaurant chain to be a place where anyone could eat well without worry. It was supposed to be affordable, welcoming. And yet, here were two kids debating whether they could share a meal because even a burger and fries might be too much of a luxury. He listened as they continued their hushed conversation. "Maybe just fries," the younger one suggested. "No, you need something better than that." "Let's see what we can do," the older one murmured, scanning the prices. Jonathan felt an unexpected lump rise in his throat. He had been a kid like that once, counting coins, stretching a few dollars. He knew what it was to stand in line, hoping the total wouldn't be too high. The line moved forward, but his mind was still on the boys. Then came the moment that made him freeze. "If we don't have enough," the younger one said quietly, "do you think they'll let us stay and just smell the food for a little while?" Jonathan's breath caught. It was such a simple, innocent question. But beneath it lay a reality no child should have to understand. The kind of hunger that wasn't just about food, but about longing. He looked up, scanning the restaurant, the employees, the customers, the quiet struggle in every corner he had failed to see from his high-rise office. This place wasn't just a business. It was part of people's lives. And he had been too blind to see how much that mattered. His hands clenched. The cashier called for the next customer. Jonathan stepped forward, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about his own order. The two boys behind him had just changed everything. Jonathan stepped up to the counter, but his mind was no longer on his own order. The quiet desperation in the younger boy's voice still echoed in his head. He stole another glance at them. Two kids staring at the menu, shifting their crumpled bills between their fingers. "What can I get for you, sir?" The teenage cashier, Emily, barely looked up as she spoke, her voice hollow from repetition. Jonathan hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Just a moment," he murmured. He stepped slightly to the side, just enough to watch what happened next. The two boys shuffled forward. The older one squared his shoulders, trying to seem confident. "Hi," he said, offering a polite nod to Emily. "Can we get one cheeseburger and—" He glanced down at his brother, measuring. "A small fries, please." Jonathan saw Emily's hesitation immediately. Her eyes flickered to the register, then to the menu, as if silently calculating whether that would be enough food for two. Her fingers hovered over the buttons, waiting. "Would you like anything to drink?" she asked, though she must have known the answer. The older boy shook his head. "Just water, please." There it was. That subtle, practiced response. The kind of answer you gave when you didn't want to admit you couldn't afford more. Emily rang up the order, and the total flashed on the screen. The younger boy's fingers uncurled, revealing the money, but Jonathan already knew it wouldn't be enough. He watched as they counted silently, pressing the coins into Emily's waiting palm, stretching every dollar. Then a pause. Emily swallowed. "You're about 50 cents short," she said, her voice softer now. The older boy nodded quickly, already reaching to take something off the order. "That's okay, It's on the house today, okay?" The voice came from behind the counter. Jonathan turned his head slightly. Sarah, the cook, the one with tired eyes and grease-stained sleeves, had stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron. Her expression was firm, but there was warmth in her voice. "Go grab a seat, boys. I'll bring it out in a minute." The younger boy's eyes widened. The older one stiffened, pride warring with gratitude. "We can pay next time," the older one said quickly. "We don't need." "I know you don't," Sarah interrupted gently. "But let me do this one, all right?" A long moment passed. Then the older boy gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Thank you," he murmured. Sarah simply winked. "You just make sure to enjoy it." A new perspective. Jonathan exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. This wasn't company policy. There was no handbook instructing employees to cover a meal for struggling customers. Sarah hadn't done it for recognition. She'd done it because it was the right thing to do. Jonathan had spent years buried in numbers, graphs, and strategies. He had measured success by margins, by growth percentages, by efficiency. But none of that had told him what really mattered. People. Sarah understood something he had forgotten. Carter's Grill wasn't just a brand, it was part of a community. A place where moments like this happened quietly, without press releases or corporate strategies. He had been blind to it. And the worst part, if he had come in tonight as CEO, dressed in his tailored suit, those boys might have left hungry. Emily would have followed company policy, unsure if she could bend the rules. Sarah might have hesitated, worried about repercussions. This place didn't need more oversight. It needed leadership that understood its heart. A quiet conversation. Jonathan stepped away from the counter and approached Sarah as she wiped down a prep station. "That was kind of you," he said. She looked up, a little wary. He was still just a customer to her. "They come in sometimes," she said with a shrug. "Not often, but enough for me to notice." Jonathan nodded, his gaze drifting to the boys, now settled in a booth. The younger one was unwrapping the burger with a kind of reverence, the older one watching him with quiet relief. "Do you do that often?" he asked. Sarah raised a brow. "Do what?" "Cover meals." She hesitated, then sighed. "Not all the time. But sometimes people need it, you know? And if it's a choice between following a rule or doing what's right, well." She wiped her hands on her apron. "I figure a burger's not going to break the company." Jonathan felt something shift in him, something deep. Sarah didn't know who he was. And yet, in a few simple words, she had given him more insight into his business than any executive report ever had. "That's a good way to look at it," he said softly. She gave a small, knowing smile. "It's just common sense, really." Jonathan nodded, turning back toward the boys. The older one caught his gaze for just a second, offering a polite nod of thanks before returning his attention to his brother. He had come here tonight expecting to see failures. Instead, he had seen something far more important: humanity. The line at the counter was moving again. Jonathan stepped away, heading toward the door, his mind racing. Everything about this place needed to change, and he was going to be the one to change it. Jonathan stepped out into the crisp night air, but for the first time in years, he wasn't in a hurry to leave work behind. The quiet exchange inside the restaurant, the The boys, Sarah, the unspoken kindness, echoed in his mind. It wasn't a corporate strategy that had saved those kids from walking away hungry. It was one person making a simple but powerful choice. He had spent years drowning in spreadsheets, fine-tuning cost analyses, and discussing market expansion. Yet none of those boardroom discussions had ever touched on what he had just witnessed. Where had he gone wrong? The answer was painfully clear. He had stopped listening. Breaking cover. The next morning, Jonathan returned, this time as himself. He strode through the glass doors of Carter's grill in a crisp, tailored suit, a stark contrast to the worn hoodie and sneakers from the night before. His presence drew immediate attention. Emily at the register straightened, her fingers hovering nervously over the touchscreen. The cook at the grill stiffened. Even Sarah, who had seemed so confident the night before, paused mid-step, her expression unreadable. Jonathan didn't speak at first. Instead, he took it all in, the way the employees braced themselves, the way conversations hushed. They expected a reprimand, a warning, maybe even someone getting fired. They didn't expect what he was about to do. He walked up to the counter and placed his hands on the surface, his tone even. Team meeting. Now. A wake-up call. Minutes later, the entire staff, cooks, cashiers, and managers, stood in the small break room, shifting uneasily. Jonathan leaned against the counter, arms crossed, taking in their tired, expectant faces. "I came in last night," he started, his voice calm but firm. "None of you knew who I was." A few exchanged wary glances. Sarah kept her gaze steady, unreadable. "I didn't come as your boss. I came as a customer. And what I saw was eye-opening." He let that sink in before continuing. "I saw employees working hard despite exhaustion. I saw a business that runs on more than just food. It runs on people. On kindness. On the small moments that corporate policies don't account for." His eyes met Sarah's. She knew what was coming. "Sarah," he said, "last night you paid for a meal out of your own pocket." A murmur went through the group. Some employees shifted uneasily, worried about what this meant. Sarah met his gaze head-on. "I did," she admitted, voice steady. "And I'd do it again." Jonathan nodded, then turned to the rest of the team. "That's the kind of leadership I want in this company." Silence. Then slow, dawning realization. "Wait, you're not mad?" Emily asked cautiously. Jonathan shook his head. "I'm grateful. But I'm also ashamed that it took an undercover visit for me to see what was missing here." He straightened. "So things are going to change. A new beginning." Jonathan laid out his plan. Higher wages. No more employees scraping by while corporate profits soared. A community meal program. Each location would have a fund to quietly cover meals for customers in need, no questions asked. Empowering employees. No more rigid, impersonal policies. Staff would have the autonomy to make judgment calls, to show kindness without fear of breaking a rule. As he spoke, something shifted in the room. The tension eased. Employees began exchanging glances, some nodding, some even smiling. For the first time in a long while, they felt seen. Sarah folded her arms, studying him. "You sure corporate's gonna like this?" Jonathan smiled. "They'll have to, because this wasn't just about business anymore. It was about doing the right thing." The boys return. 2 weeks later, Jonathan found himself back at the restaurant. Not as an undercover customer, not as an authoritative CEO, but simply as a man who wanted to witness the impact of change. He didn't have to wait long. The boys returned. This time, they walked in with less hesitation. The older one carried something, a folded piece of paper, carefully creased, as if handled many times. The younger one looked up at the counter, eyes scanning for a familiar face. Sarah spotted them first. She smiled and waved them over. Jonathan, seated in a quiet corner, watched as the older boy handed her the paper. "What's this?" she asked. "A thank you," the boy said simply. Sarah unfolded the paper. It was a drawing, crayon lines forming a picture of a burger, fries, and a smiling sun overhead. At the bottom, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for being nice. We won't forget." For the first time in years, Jonathan Carter felt something shift inside him. Not the stress of quarterly reports. Not the weight of business expansion. Just a quiet, undeniable sense of purpose. Because real success wasn't measured in profit margins. It was measured in moments like this.